The title of my DDes dissertation is a few philosophical arguments for the artificial architecture debate, 15th until 19th century. In fact, I'm dealing with a few things that are also let's say, present during the 20th century or developed during the 20th century. But with this title, I really wanted to emphasize the fact that I was trying to find some roots, or let's say the roots of some important philosophical problems that are nowadays included in the current debate about artificial intelligence, neural architecture, or as I call it, or let's say computational architecture made with the help of artificial intelligence, or more let's say directly, as I call it, artificial architecture, which I believe is going to be the architecture of the future. So yeah, it's moving. I will start by introducing the summary of my dissertation. It has 5 parts, plus the introduction and the conclusion, so seven parts in total. In the introduction, I'm dealing with a few questions associated with computationalism and the mechanization of knowledge. I'm also introducing the fact that I will be discussing a lot in the thesis about that I'm discussing a lot in the thesis about the Renaissance. Especially regarding the relationship between between abstract knowledge and machines at the Renaissance. I'm doing this mainly through the studying of Alberti, by the way. I'm just introducing the structure of the thesis and the question in the background, which in fact is the possibility of an artificial architecture. The possibility of an artificial architecture means an architecture that would be just entirely generated thanks to artificial intelligence. But in fact, it's not as simple as that. It's an architecture that wouldn't be trained ultimately by making use of all the past architecture that have been generated by humans. Because I believe that if you train a model on human generated data, ultimately you introduce a kind of intrinsic anthropomorphism in the output, and I'm really asking the possibility of, let's say, getting rid of this anthropomorphism trying to speculate about what would be an artificial architecture that would be truly artificial, by the way. Really something that's generated by the computer, but let's say from the point of view of the computer, which means from the point of view of information and computation and nothing else. In a sense, I'm asking this question, but in this very thesis, I'm not addressing directly that question. This is something that I will be doing later on. I'm addressing, let's say, the philosophical foundations of that very question. For example, what are the limits to knowledge? What kind of use should we do when we have a certain kind of knowledge, or when we have like specific power or specific superpower, let's say, as we have today, and obviously in the future we might have even more computational superpowers. So I'm addressing in a sense the philosophical basis, or let's say the philosophical roots of some of the questions associated with this, the possibility of knowledge, the kind of knowledge we are dealing with, the ethics of knowledge, which obviously is also associated with the ethics of artificial intelligence nowadays. But yeah, I'm doing this from, let's say, an historical point of view. So in the first part, I'm addressing a few historiographical questions and problems, the role of matter and materiality, for example, the relationship between materials, machines, and concepts. So I consider machines and materials as conceptual objects. Also, I'm dealing with, I'm addressing the difficult issue of when something does start. I mean, when we call something the Renaissance, for example, what are we really speaking about? When does it really start? If we speak about the age of computational intelligence, what does it mean? When does it start, etc., etc. In the second part, I'm going through the evolution of Western science, starting from the Renaissance until the end of the 19th century, trying to show what are the, I mean, our conception of science did evolve in time. At the very beginning, we could say that science was still a kind of highly empirical kind of research. We know that thanks to a couple of philosophers, I mean, I call them philosophers because during the early 17th century, we were not talking about scientific people as we are doing today. So thanks to some of these philosophers, we smoothly started to escape pure empiricism. We started to develop mathematical hypotheses, to have a radically different look at the role of scientific instruments, also a different look at machines. So I'm dealing with this in the second part. What can we know? In the third part, I'm addressing a few mathematical concepts that I believe are important. So I could say that most of these concepts are, let's say, pre-AI age. The understanding of all of those concepts is extremely important if we really want to understand the shift from computational architecture towards what I call artificial architecture. But let's say most of these concepts are really at the interface. I mean, they are more on the side of computational architecture and computational geometry, and some of them can be applied to what we are doing nowadays within the domain of artificial architecture. So I'm not really addressing post or non-geometrical concepts, except a few ones like repetition and arithmetization. But let's say most of all, I'm addressing concepts that come just before the age of artificial architecture. In the fourth part, I'm trying to deal with more general things associated with the reason through the eyes of Descartes, for example. Also addressing empiricism and the limit of natural perception. When I speak about the limits of natural perception, what I'm interested in mostly is a kind of a moral statement coming from people who say that we should put a limit to the quantity of knowledge we should develop, but also a moral statement which says that whatever we know about nature, whatever the content the quantity of knowledge we can get about nature, ultimately, it doesn't change anything because it's not nature, let's say, because nature has to be conceived in a completely different philosophical framework, different from the positivist philosophical framework. In the fifth part, what should we know? Rereading the Quattrocento. Here, I'm really addressing through the eyes of Alberti different problems associated with the social legitimacy of knowledge, with the philosophical legitimacy of science. At the time of Alberti, it was not called science as we call it today. Obviously, the scienza name refer to to a much more global understanding of the world, and it was not particularly scientific, by the way, except for the one who were addressing this through a kind of Aristotelian conceptual frame. Also, I'm addressing the relationship between Alberti and the knowledge of the ultimate cause, but not just like ultimate or final causes or first principles, as we also call them, but let's say the knowledge about like even like the standard causality. Which obviously, knowing the standard causality is just at the very basis of the scientific construct, starting from Galileo, and obviously in the 19th century, it became ever more important. I'm also addressing the position, the ethical position of Alberti regarding the excess of knowledge. Because I believe that we mechanically produce knowledge, what are we doing with this mechanical excedent of knowledge? So the general introduction is that, architecture was, let's say this, for most people, architecture is about construction, it's a bit about form, it's a bit about materiality. In this work, I'm saying that architecture is ultimately about the mind. It's about the computer. It's about a machine which is ultimately embedded, or which exists in literally billions of copies. And which is present in each single tiny little room in a big city like this. This is Los Angeles. And ultimately, I believe that there's no way we can really understand architecture at the age of artificial intelligence without understanding what a computer is really about. So this is my, let's say, super general conceptual endeavor. I'm interested in that for like maybe 25 years, maybe even more than that, I don't know, but probably 25 years. I'm really interested in understanding this absolutely amazing and crazy machine, which is called the computer. And I use this understanding of the computer to try to understand better what our current architecture is about. So if I look at those things, for example, the obvious difference is not in the building. If I look at Miss and the current suburb in LA, the difference is not in the building because they are very, very similar. The difference is in the management of all of that. And obviously the management is done by a computer, and everything is done by a computer nowadays. So trying to create or to generate a discourse on artificial intelligence, but let's say more precisely for me on artificial architecture, um, obviously has to start with the fact that we are not into a rationalist society anymore, but we are entering a new age, which is the one of computationalism. So as you know, and I already explained this quite many times, it's the age of data, and lots of works have been dedicated to these questions. I would say like tens of thousands of books and hundreds of thousands of papers, of scientific papers. But the great change, a big change recently is artificial intelligence, which according to Geoffrey Hinton will even, let's say, it might even enlarge the power, the intrinsic power and the already amazing power of computers. Thanks to that, we are facing many different problems like maybe technological unemployment, a problem that was first stated by David Ricardo at the very beginning of the 19th century. We know that, for example, if we look at this image, behind an image like this, there's at least two persons that will get out of jobs. The graphic designer, probably, and the model, because in this case, we don't need these people. But more on a more fundamental level, what is kind of striking is that when we look at the history of architecture, it's more or less 12,000 years of human-made architecture, and it's only 50 years at the very max of computer-generated architecture. And I have to say, so far, we would hardly find a building that would be entirely generated by a computer. So it's not even sure that we can talk about 50 years of computer generated architecture. But thanks to artificial intelligence, in any case, we will have to speak about computer generated architecture. It's not an open question anymore. We know the answer. What we don't know as an answer is how is it going to, to work? How this will happen? What is going to be the shape of this global transformation? So when we look at this global history of architecture, it's kind of amazing because it's all about human-made architecture, ultimately. And everything we know about architecture so far is about this. It's about human-made architecture. And probably for the very first time in the history of architecture, we are now starting to move beyond this human-made architecture and to see this kind of stuff, let's say. Okay, it looks like standard architecture, but obviously the way it's done is not standard. These buildings also are very similar to what we would be able to generate in a standard way, let's say, but again, it has been generated by artificial intelligence. What's interesting here is that obviously it creates a blur, a very difficult situation regarding the reality, or what we call reality. Not just because it looks like reality, but because at some point it is reality. If these images are put online, and they will be used as training set for upcoming artificial intelligence models. So basically, what we could call reality today is just like something which is used in the training of an AI model. And the blur between what we call reality or virtuality, which was already addressed as a conceptual question by many philosophers, including Deleuze, who spent quite a lot of time on this, is now becoming more radical than ever. So some researchers, theoreticians, technologists have worked on that question and many other questions associated with artificial intelligence. I mean, I cannot name all of these researchers, but obviously Neil knows a lot about that because he wrote this already classic book. And people like Mario Carpo, even if, let's say, he didn't address specifically what I call artificial architecture, also try to understand the context of how architecture did appear in the recent history of architecture. I also did this myself, partly trying to address the relationship between architecture and politics, for example, but also trying to address the relationship between architecture and business or business models, because I really believe that it's an important question, but I'm not dealing with this question in the dissertation, but it is a very, very important question. So basically, we have this 12,000 years of human-made architecture and 50 years of possibly computer-generated architecture. Let's say the recent history of this computational architecture is that we started with the architecture machines, and we started to think about algorithmic design and aesthetics, digital architecture, parametric design, material ecology, parametricism, robotic architecture, computational architecture, and super intelligent architecture, which I'm definitely a proponent of this super intelligent architecture. As I said, recently, a few authors, including Neil, investigated the issue of artificial intelligence, but also Matthias Del Campo and many colleagues that are developing extremely interesting work. According to me, if we really want to understand what's happening today, we need to dissect the computational basis of super intelligent architecture, and from that, rather than, let's say, trying to repeat all debates, it's just better to study these old debates and to extract some interesting arguments that are still used today in the artificial architecture debate, and it's exactly what I try to do in my dissertation. Some people say that artificial intelligence is nothing. They say that, as Yann Lequin said, that it's just glorified curve fitting. Obviously, Yann Lequin is not, or Yann LeCun in English, but in French is Lequin. Yann Lequin says that it's not true. It goes beyond curve fitting. There's some very interesting debates about that, but whatever the exact mathematical nature of this potentially curve fitting in high dimensional space or hyperdimensional space, the fact is that it works extremely well, and that it starts to create a kind of ambient super intelligence around us every day. And ChatGPT is an interesting proof of that, by the way. So I'm trying to think about the architectural problem at the age of artificial intelligence by not paying attention to forms as well. This is already what I tried to do in the past, trying to understand a bit better what computational architecture was about, starting with the work of Peter Eisenman. And in that sense, I have to say that I have a really non-materialist approach of the problem. So it's not by chance that I referred at that moment almost 20 years ago to Peter, or let's say 15 years ago to Peter Eisenman, because in fact I was already trying to understand things, even when they are extremely materialist, let's say, like this, beyond the issue of material. So this is why I speak in the first part, sorry, in the introduction, this is why I speak about computationalism and the mechanization of knowledge. Ultimately, I believe architecture is a problem, is a knowledge-based problem, nothing else. It's, I mean, almost by chance, I started to lead a class at the Bartlett, which is dedicated to architecture as a knowledge-based process, which is kind of fun because I didn't create this class, but I always believed that architecture is something which ultimately is a knowledge related problem and almost nothing else than that. Even material problems or material conditions, I believe that ultimately they are solved through intelligence, abstract intelligence, and they are not solved through matter by itself. In fact, matter is nothing else than the projection of our own intelligence onto something that ultimately we don't even know, by the way, exactly what it is, but we know enough to let's say to make it a kind of support of abstract intelligence. And this is exactly what happened in the 20th century when we created the computer chip or the transistor. The transistor is just a stupid piece of silicon which exists in the world at billions of tons, or maybe millions of billions of tons. But because we are capable of projecting our abstract intelligence into it, we can transform this silicon or this sand, by the way, either in glass or, for example, in a transistor, in a computer chip or whatever. So yeah, I'm dealing with a non-materialist approach. But dealing with a non-materialist approach does not mean that I'm an idealist. I believe that ultimately things depend on material conditions, but these material conditions are not material. So this could appear as a kind of paradox, but it's not a paradox. What I call the material conditions are in fact the let's say the total amount of knowledge that we can make use of, or the total amount of knowledge that has been generated by humans. What's interesting is that when we look at the way ChatGPT or other large language models are working, it's exactly what it does. I mean, ChatGPT is just collecting all the knowledge that has ever been generated. I mean, not exactly all the knowledge that has ever been generated, because not everything has been encoded into a digital form. But this might happen in the future. So in any way, the material condition are knowledge-based conditions. So I'm dealing with, I'm taking this as an example of what I want to say about the relationship between the materiality and the abstraction of things. I'm saying, for example, that this machine is pretty interesting, but ultimately it's interesting only on a purely conceptual level, because the materiality of that machine has absolutely no importance in its own development throughout the history of techniques. I'm referring to the Renaissance because here there's some interesting debate about the relationship between, let's say, like the very clean and abstract mathematical knowledge as we can find it, for example, in this drawing, and a more experimental kind of knowledge that is applied into the development of machines, or also a knowledge that sometimes comes, so is extracted afterwards from the development of these machines. So this leads to me to historiographical and potentially historiographical problems, including the one of materials that I mentioned before. But as I said, the issue of material is ultimately a rather unimportant issue. And by the way, it sheds some light on the problem of periodization, because things are so messy when we start looking at materials that ultimately we understand that developing let's say a purely materialist understanding of history and also a purely materialist understanding of the evolution of architecture can only lead to a failure, because the history of material itself is much more complex than what most architectural historians or theorists or even architects are thinking. So basically, I'm moving away from the materiality of the machine to the abstraction. I'm showing that in the 19th century, probably the most important event that happened was a turn towards a much higher level of abstraction in science, and a kind of mathematization of everything. This is what we call usually positivism in the history of science, or in the history of Western thought. And I'm showing that in the 20th century, I mean, this is important because ultimately this is exactly what happened in the 20th century. So if I go back to the Renaissance and to these historiographical problems, it's because the Renaissance has been, in many cases, envisioned as, let's say, especially the early Renaissance, the Quattrocento, as something which is rather clean and Platonicist and abstract. But if we look at these figures, for example, we have to understand that those are attributed to Alberti, but in fact they never existed in the very first edition of Alberti's De Re Edificatoria. But in fact, the Renaissance is not this like clean and Platonist context that many wants to let's say wants to see. It is an highly experimental and fuzzy and dirty world in which the relationship between the abstraction of knowledge and let's say the intrinsic experimental nature of machines is constantly moving, and this is why I'm interested in the Renaissance, especially through this problem, because I believe this is pretty much what is happening at the moment. This complex relationship between a new kind of knowledge which is associated with computer science, which again at the scale of history is extremely recent, and also a new kind of machine, the computer, which also at the scale of history is extremely recent. So I see a lot of similarities between what is happening today when we look at the relationship between the mathematical models in artificial intelligence, for example, and the machine itself. It's highly empirical, but at the same time, some very strong mathematicians try to come up with a real theory of artificial intelligence. It has to be mentioned that we don't have it yet. I take the example in my dissertation of the development of the scientific units. For example, before the invention of the steam engine, we didn't even have a concept of energy. We had a very fuzzy concept of force, which in many cases was also a metaphysical concept. But during the 19th century, we developed the concept of energy. And then the energy was quantified in an extremely precise mathematical way, getting its own scientific unit. And then this kind of mechanism happened exactly in the same way during the 20th century with the concept of information. Before Claude Shannon and a couple of other researchers, the information was a rather fuzzy idea. It was not a clearly scientific concept, but after Shannon, information was both an extremely well-defined scientific concept, and it also got its own scientific measurement unit, which is a bit. So basically, what I'm saying, it's just like 2 lines in my thesis. What I'm saying is that in the future, we might also have a unit for the quantity of intelligence that will be generated by artificial intelligence. And when we will have this, then we will, I mean, that's my feeling, that we will truly enter a completely new world. Because once we will have a scientific unit for the measurement of artificial intelligence, we will apply these scientific units to humans. We try to quantify human intelligence through the IQ, for example, but I mean, it's definitely not a rigorous measure of intelligence, and in any case, it's not a scientific unit, a scientific measurement of intelligence. It's highly qualitative and it's not quantitative. So basically, if I'm interested in machines, we have to keep in mind in the back of our head that it's not because it does things in the world. It's really because conceptually speaking, it implies a lot of highly fundamental questions. And again, for example, the evolution of the steam engine to a rather basic machine to something which led to the development of the concept of energy and to the development of a scientific unit, and then to many extremely important laws in thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. That I think this is really interesting, and that's the way I'm trying to deal with artificial intelligence. So what can we know? As I said, in this part, I'm trying to deal with this issue of machines, the relationship between the machine and the more empirical approaches. I'm studying this again for the different periods, but starting mostly from the Quattrocento, because I believe that this problem didn't change that much, even if we have much more advanced scientific instrument. I think the fundamental philosophical basis of these problems are still here today. Just a quick note, you hear me well, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. If there's anything wrong, please let me know. I'm addressing the problem of the final causes, the problem of determinism, laws of nature, early 17th century, late 17th century, 18th century, and I'm also showing how our scientific language evolved from rather fuzzy notions associated with final causes to more precise ones associated, for example, with concept of foundations. We all know that the old mechanization, I mean, let's say the philosophical view associated with celestial mechanics also became a common view associated with mechanization, as for example in this work by Siegfried Gideon. It was associated with clocks and watches, especially for Leibniz. Leibniz was still considering the world as being created by a watchmaker, and he was still considering the world as a mechanism, basically. But thanks to Pascal and to the logic of Port-Royal and to the grammar of Port-Royal, we started to pay more attention to the issue of language. What's interesting here, I'm not discussing in depth in the dissertation the work of Port-Royal. I'm just showing that by paying attention to a less mechanical paradigm, but also by trying to create a kind of synthesis between let's say the mathematization of science coming from Galileo and the new rules that were established by Descartes. The school of Port-Royal managed to create some interesting, a kind of interesting synthesis through the concept, I mean, through the concept of grammar and through the study of linguistic problems. It's important, according to me, because later on, in the 19th century, with the work of Georges Boole, this is we can see this work as a kind of endeavor trying to discover what are the laws of thought, which as a concept is still at the very core of everything we are dealing with in artificial intelligence, because ultimately AI researchers are really just trying to find what are the laws of artificial intelligence. I mean, obviously we know it works, not always, by the way, but I mean, any genuine scientist is not interested in something that just works, you know. Any genuine scientist is interested in understanding why it works and what are the laws that are behind some such or such a phenomenon. And this is exactly what happens in artificial intelligence. So, by the way, I'm mentioning in the thesis the fact that Georges Boole probably managed to extract some very important underlying principles regarding the question of thinking on a logical level, but on a physical level, we still know very little about that. So the 19th century tried to understand more things associated with the physicality of things. So it's not, I mean, really trying to merge, let's say, what happens on an abstract level and what happens on a more material level. But ultimately, it didn't really succeed. I'm also showing, as I said, how our knowledge evolved from an empirical knowledge to a more and more mathematical knowledge, and how we made use of the concept of foundation, so that we can really be sure about why such a thing happens in nature. At the very moment, for example, in artificial intelligence, we can say that we don't really have strong foundations for this domain, but this is what AI researchers, especially the ones that are, let's say, working mostly on the mathematical understanding of artificial intelligence, are trying to do. Anyway, nowadays, if we want to move to like more recent concept like computer simulation and all of that, we need to develop completely different kinds of understanding, that scientific understanding and scientific tools that appeared in the 19th century. So this is why I'm trying to also address some of these things on a more mathematical level. This is why I say I'm speaking here in this third part about certain mathematical concepts necessary for understanding the 19th century. I'm addressing what is the dominant geometry in the 19th and 20th architectural centuries, which, by the way, is descriptive geometry developed by Monge, Gaspard Monge. He didn't completely invented it, because in fact it existed for a really long time in the Middle Age, and Monge, by the way, acknowledged that he knew that he was not inventing something new, but he just wanted to put a bit of clarity, to bring some clarity into the mathematical understanding of descriptive geometry. So I'm addressing a couple of concepts. For me, it's not completely new to be interested in that. I was already in the past interested in trying to understand what's behind all of these things that happen in a CAD software like Rhino here, for example. And this is why I use Mathematica, writing some of the function by myself, because I really wanted to understand how those things really worked, by the way. But what's important on a more conceptual level is this: the problem of generality and universality. And I'm showing that at the time of Monge, most scientists and mathematicians were really interested in the generality of the mathematical tools they were developing. So Monge was interested in that, but also Laplace, by the way. And this is a kind of famous image about the introduction of the nowadays widely shared measurement unit of the kilograms of the meter in France. So when we look at the work of Monge, and when we read Monge, he said that he was interested in bringing some generality and bringing some common language in the discipline of architecture. So at some point we can say yes, he managed to do it until a certain point, because the descriptive geometry was used everywhere, especially in any kind of technical drawing and engineering for almost 200 years. And he was looking also for a kind of common language for that. So this is what he said in 1793, and it's also what is repeating in every edition of this descriptive geometry. And obviously descriptive geometry is a visual language, and this is why ultimately, according to me, this is why architecture has always, not always, but for such a long part, and for so many architects, is in most cases associated with first problems that are dealing with geometry, because it's much easier to understand than algebra, but also because in fact, I mean, the conceptual framework for the understanding of Western architecture has been the conceptual framework of descriptive geometry. So it didn't really matter if we make use of that. What's important is that ultimately it's a framework which is not dealing with some of the most important concepts that let's say that matter today. And some of these concepts are much more abstract. As I said, they are associated with discretization, with the concept of repetition, with the concept of approximation or computer simulations. And there's very few geometry or no geometrical problem in when we deal with this concept on a more scientific manner. The funny thing is that when Morel was introducing the descriptive geometry, Laplace was introducing the mechanic analytic, and he was really proud of saying that there's no figure in this drawing. By the way, here I want to mention that some of these things have been mentioned by many architectural historians or theorists, but in a lot of cases, at least according to me, it's not 100% satisfactory. For example, Perez Gomez dealt with some of this question, but it didn't make any strong distinction between Laplace and Monge, while in fact, according to me, they represent two highly opposed ways of looking at the world. He also didn't make a distinction by when he spoke about Laplace. He didn't really make a strong distinction between the deterministic Laplace, let's say, and what we could almost call the probabilistic Laplace. And while in fact, for me, it's absolutely essential to make a clear distinction between the determinism of Laplace and the fact that he was himself highly aware about the fact that this determinism was what a kind of new idealism that doesn't work in reality. So there is a kind of misreading of the deterministic nature of modern science, which is also associated with a misreading of Laplace, because Laplace himself said that stochastic phenomenon are making the theory of probability extremely important and necessary in science. We all know that postmodern science was trying to address things on a more probabilistic level, but in fact, again, it's not just postmodern science. I would say it's most of the science starting from the beginning of the 19th century, sorry, thanks to the work of Laplace. And if this is important, by the way, it's also because Laplace had an amazingly important influence on the development of the British algebraic school at the beginning of the 19th century, including on George Boole. So it's kind of really interesting because George Boole wrote his laws of thought on which the theory of probabilities is based. In fact, George Boole had in mind the work of Laplace dedicated to the probabilities. So it's let's say it's important because at the very heart of the work of George Boole, there is this concept of uncertainty and probability. And obviously, it's a concept that we still find, or let's say more than ever, that is at the heart of artificial intelligence, because with artificial intelligence, we don't have any certainties. I mean, AI is not deterministic. It's just like we try to infer. I mean, it's. I mean, it's, by the way, it's not even deductive. It's inductive or abductive. We try to infer some probabilities of events based on past events, basically. So yeah, for me, philosophically speaking, I'm interested in that because, again, I know how important the concept of probability is for artificial intelligence. And I know how important it was at the very beginning of the development of the Boolean logic by George Boole. And also, I know how important it is in the theory of information, either in the classical theory of information by Shannon or in subsequent theories of information. Yeah, anyway. So I'm just mentioning the fact that thanks to algebra, we can transform all geometry into algebraic problem. And I'm trying to show that, let's say, ultimately, things are not about geometry. They are about much more abstract things. And they are also not about language, as it was thought in recent architecture, because when we deal with artificial intelligence, especially with large language models, for example, we don't deal with linguistic issues because I mean, there's no concept of language. For example, in ChatGPT, which is a very interesting fact to note, by the way. So there is a conceptual difference between what happened in the recent world of computational architecture, which is based on simulation, or let's say traditional simulation, making use of standard mathematical models that are intertrained through what we call polyformalism. So polyformalism is a concept that I'm borrowing from a French epistemologist whose name is Franck Varenne, an extremely brilliant and interesting epistemologist who was trained as a scientist in signal theory, and then he moved toward the philosophy of science and epistemology. He's probably one of the best now in France, by the way. In the France part, I'm dealing slightly with the reason beyond mathematics and empiricism and the limit of natural perception. We all know, as Etienne Jules Marais said, that nowadays, I mean, if we want to make progress in science, we cannot make use of our very senses or let's say our sense data. It's an interesting fact because it's also the case, obviously, in artificial intelligence and artificial architecture, because there's no way we can conceptualize or we can represent in our mind, let's say, what means 150 billions of parameters in an artificial intelligence model. So I mean, this radical shift from the sense data to something which exceeds in an amazingly radical way any kind of sense data is super important. And here I see the roots of this I mean, at the turn of the 16th and 17th century, at the end of the 16th and 17th century, especially with Galileo and Copernicus, etc. But maybe even more than that, because it was really perfectly conceptualized or theorized during the 19th century. In architecture, all this, let's say, this idea of the sense data, this idea of capturing movement, this idea of something, even the classification by Linné, for example, of those, all of these things that could still be associated with a certain kind of intuition, with a certain kind of sensibility, I think is completely disappearing nowadays. But we have to mention that in the theory of architecture, it was still in use in the 90s, almost in 2000, because this is a book from 1999. But all of that, again, the roots of all of this understanding of the world as something which is always in a kind of morphogenetic state, as its roots in the beginning of 19th century and mid 19th century, for example, with Granville, with Emerson in the US, especially in the book Nature in 1844. And also later on, as we all know, with Darcy Thompson in 1917 and Greg Lynn. So also, if I'm showing this image, I don't really mention that, or very quickly, let's say, in my dissertation, but it's important. Let's say it's important because ultimately there's a very large part of the architecture of the first digital turn, which find its philosophical and conceptual roots, not only in the Baroque, as it was mentioned many times, including by Greg Lynn, for example, himself, but also in a kind of tradition of science, which is, let's say, not too scientific, which exists at the heart of the 19th century, which led also to the vitalist understanding of the living world, for example, etc., etc. And obviously, those things are nowadays completely, let's say, off the global pictures. Not just because we change the style of things, but because the conceptual and the philosophical framework, which is relevant for the understanding of what's happening today. Again, I'm not speaking about computational architecture. I'm not speaking about discretism in a way it might have been done in the recent past. I'm really speaking about something else, which has to do with artificial architecture. So I make a strong distinction between computational architecture and what I call artificial architecture, because the conceptual framework is fundamentally different. So I end up my thesis by looking at a kind of moral position about what knowledge should be about, what we should know, what we should try to know. Is there some limits about the about the knowledge that we are, let's say, authorized to develop or to acquire? Is there some social legitimacy for knowledge? So here I really go back to Alberti, because Alberti ultimately developed an understanding of the use of knowledge, which is very classical. I mean, classical in the sense that it's based on Cicerone and Plato. It's let's say it's definitely a pre-modern understanding of our relationship with knowledge as a whole, and especially with mechanical and scientific knowledge, because Alberti was extremely critical both about the machines that were developed at this time. He was constantly, let's say, sorry, I don't find my word in English. He was constantly Okay, anyway, he didn't consider that machines were truly important for different reasons, but ultimately it was mostly for moral or ethical reason. I mean, yeah, moral rather than ethical, because it's obviously different. But it was mostly for moral reasons that he didn't pay attention to machines. But when we look, for example, at the work of Jean Erard or people like that, which came a century after Alberti, we see that some absolutely amazing understanding of the role of mathematics, the role of physics, and ultimately the role of machines. For example, Jacques Besson here says that, yeah, I mean, he dedicates his work to what we would call today the optimization of machines. And he says that we won't find anything in his publication, in his book, which is not based on the use of reason. He's saying this before Descartes, by the way, which is not based on the use of reason, which itself is making use of mathematics and physics. So it's for me, it really shows that at some point, again, this relationship between the abstract knowledge of mathematics and the technical knowledge of machines, which is nowadays what we are doing, or what computer scientists are doing when they develop um, um, artificial intelligence models, which are, I mean, that's really what they are saying themselves, which are still in an highly empirical state. So basically, there's a lot to learn from this, and from this opposition between Alberti and some other Renaissance architects, mechanical engineer, let's say inventors, etc., etc. Alberti takes the example of the flying man. He says, I mean, he really despises the fact that some people want to fly, and clearly, if we would apply this today, we would probably have a kind of interesting position about what would be the role of artificial intelligence, what would be the role of super intelligence, and what is the role, more generally speaking, of technology and knowledge in our society. For example, regarding questions like transhumanisms or that kind of questions. So yeah, I think this is it. I hope you'll enjoy the reading the dissertation. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you. Just to say, for those, we've just received the document, so we will be looking through that. I'll be able to start tomorrow. Maybe you could send us a doc version rather than a PDF, so we could actually easily kind of put comments.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, the problem with the doc version is that it's not really clean, because I mean the display is ugly.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, maybe. I mean, thank you for a very erudite and scholarly journey. And I understand that this is going to continue, I imagine, and become the book, as it were, or maybe a 2-volume book.
Yeah, probably something like that, I hope.
Yeah. Could I just what I really appreciate the kind of trying to trace the origins of certain thought processes going back through history, and to see that history is very much part of the present in some senses, in the sense that nothing comes from nowhere. And I also think that we need to think in terms, even if we're futuristic, we need to think in terms of the relationship in the past and the present. I mean, I love this expression, tomorrow, today will be yesterday. In other words, when we look back at history, we're looking back at a kind of a series of innovations, not something static, but was actually they molded and changed history. And I think we need to see history as a kind of living fabric of ideas that's there. And it's it everything was contemporary once. And I think that's an important kind of concept. But maybe I could just, in a way, just ask a slightly provocative question in some ways. I mean, I'm beginning to realize now that my own background in Alberti is probably more significant than I realized it would be back in those days, and not just because Alberti's name begins with A and ends in I, but actually because I think a lot of these things he was kind of foundational in many ways, sort of. Now, I wanted to just go and challenge that and kind of look at the sort of. Maybe could we go back to the slide that you had of Vitruvian Man? I think there are two of them side by side. One was Vitruvius himself, way back at the very kind of towards the beginning. Yeah, way back when. Further back.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
So, okay.
Oh no, sorry. I moved. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I guess. I mean, I think though, and I forget who it was now who was talking about there wasn't just one Renaissance, but a series of renaissances that had happened through history. I don't think it was a bit covert. Anyway, whatever. But the important thing, I think, in some ways, is to realize that I think, in any case, in any event where we tend to sort of think there was a radical break from the past, possibly that break wasn't so much a kind of revolution as an evolution, perhaps one could say. And I think there's always a kind of dialectic connection in the sense you are coming out of some kind of background condition or building upon a background condition or contrasting what you're doing with a background condition. And certainly, I mean, I don't know much about Brunelleschi, although I did rather presumptuously write an entry for an encyclopedia about architecture and wrote about Brunelleschi. And one of the things I think I tried to emphasize there was actually Brunelleschi was kind of had his feet in both camps in some senses. He was very much
definitely
coming out of a kind of Gothic tradition, and we could see that in the way the kind of the emphasis on structure in the Socrates he worked on and so on. But also, of course, in the Florence Cathedral, and it really was an understanding of structural behavior, and rather than making the kind of the rather simplistic division between the kind of Renaissance representational logic and a kind of Gothic process-based logic, I think you could see that actually he had his foot in both camps. And I think to some extent, you could say the same with Alberti for different reasons. I mean, first of all, as is very obvious in some ways, and maybe it's not so obvious, but having translated him, what was kind of interesting was the failure to acknowledge Vitruvius. I mean, partly because he was trying to trash Vitruvius in a way. And there was a big difference between Alberti and Vitruvius. Vitruvius really wrote appalling Latin. It was kind of your average jobbing architect in a really, I don't know, whatever. And
I lost you.
Alberti wrote beautiful Cicero. There was a difference, and trying to translate Vitruvius. How do you do that? Do you present it in bad English? Bad Latin, bad English. Anyway, what he does refer to Vitruvius throughout, and it's there. And of course, the whole Renaissance was really about a kind of rebirth of a classical tradition. In other words, they seem to think that they'd gone wrong in the Middle Ages, and they need to get back to a consistent language in terms of Latin, and also, of course, a consistent way of approaching architecture. So it wasn't as though it was a rebirth. That's the name it means, literally. But the figure on the right is particularly interesting. This one of Vitruvian Man. And of course, there were two of these Vitruvian men of this particular model. And what I would say is this: is that alongside that notion of of the Gothic or the medieval, whatever you call it. There's also another kind of aspect, which is in a sense the kind of the way in which this interfaces with the world of the Christian world. And a while back I wrote this piece, Vitruvius Crucifixus. I mean, pointing out, and there were a number of threads, but I won't go into all of them. But basically, that a lot of the crucifixes in that time were actually model of Vitruvian man. And of course, you can see it kind of the way the hands spread out and things. It looks like the crucifix in some way, and that kind of the inscription above, like the RMNRI inscription above the crucifix. And there were, so in a way, there was a kind of a folding of one tradition, the kind of the Christianization of Vitruvius, but also to some extent the Vitruvianization of Christ, or maybe it's not the way around, the Vitruvianization of Christ, but also Christianization of Vitruvius. In other words, there was another parallel tradition that was infecting and destabilizing and contaminating that worldview. And just from a kind of straightforward linguistic point of view, and I've never made this comment before, but it is a fact that in the translation, I mean, the real problem about translating Alberti was there was no library, there was no dictionary at the time. There was Ducange, that was a medieval dictionary of medieval Latin, and there was the kind of Lewis and Short classical dictionary, but there was no Renaissance Latin, partly because Alberti himself was instrumental in launching Italian from being a kitchen language into being a bona fide academic language. And of course, he translated De Pictura into Della Pittura and so on. He was instrumental in that. And so, but there was nothing. So when it came to certain words, we were just lost. I mean, I was lost rather because I was doing the translation. You know, there was a word, for example, and a lot of neologisms came in, of course, but there was a word that I came across, trabeatio, and trabeatio, and I went to Ducange, and it said it's crucifix, and eventually it became clear that what they were referring to was a truss, and of course crucifix was the closest you could get to that, and so on and whatever. But you could see even within that sort of world, it was infused and infected by a kind of Christianized logic and so on. So what I would say is that I think that notion of the Renaissance as a clean break is only partially true. And I think there's another line you could take in a kind of provocative line. I mean, I totally accept that there was a fundamental shift in a certain sort of way of thinking happening then. But alongside that, there was a kind of a background against which it was playing that has a more dialectical role to play, and that destabilizes that. But that's just my own personal interpretation.
No, I totally agree, because in fact, that's what I'm saying in the dissertation, is that the Renaissance, especially the Quattrocento, was much more impure than what most people say and see. And in fact, let's say, it was a kind of, it has been largely influenced by the philosophy of Aristotle, while many readers say that it's the kind of victory of Plato against scholasticism, against Aristotle, which is partly wrong, if not entirely wrong. And if I'm really interested in that, it's because what we are experiencing at the very moment is very similar to this kind of impure situation, which is mixing like mathematical ideas, of course, but also ideals with much more experimental and practical ways of investigation. And more or less what I'm saying is that in some of the critiques we might see today against artificial intelligence, we have different kinds of critique. One kind of critique would, I mean, it's not that it could come, is that it comes from the people who say it's not clean, it's not clean enough, you know, and at some point they very much believe in this kind of perfect world of mathematics, which is a Platonicist or a Platonic understanding of the world, but also a Platonic understanding of mathematics. And there are some people who say, oh, it's okay. I mean, it's normal that artificial intelligence is just like totally experimental because ultimately it has always been like that. I mean, the history of humankind is about experiments. And I mean, we never really had a kind of clean situation. And the fact that this kind of clean situation might have existed in the Quattrocento is a bit of, as some scholars say, it's a myth. It's a myth. It didn't exist. Another thing is regarding the critique of artificial intelligence is also coming from the people who say that it's too much. I mean, it's just too much. It goes beyond what is morally acceptable. And this kind of critique was exactly the one of Alberti against the development of knowledge at his time. And for that reason, Alberti is extremely traditional, or let's say conservative. I mean, on a social and political level, we can consider him as amazingly progressive and innovative, according to let's say today's standards. But we should acknowledge the fact that he had, I mean, the relationship between Alberti and technology sorry, the relationship of Alberti with technology and with advanced knowledge, again, is a very conservative relationship. It's a very conservative approach because Alberti believed that there's no use for let's say, no interesting use of technology or techniques at his time. I mean, no interesting use of machines, but also there's ultimately no interesting use of knowledge because but I mean, it was a very religious position, but we should not violate we should not rape the domain of God at some point. But even if people now think in a much less religious framework, conceptual framework, what is still interesting is that there's many people who believe that we should not go too far with artificial intelligence for moral reasons. And both, I mean, these moral reasons were already existing when technology started to let's say to spread all over Europe at the beginning of at the very beginning of the Renaissance, and also a deeper moral relationship with knowledge as a whole started to become a very important problem at that time. And it was not really a problem before, because, for example, in the Greek philosophy, the relationship with machine, it's not really a moral problem because there's so few machines at that time that it does not really represent any danger or something like that. So the Greek philosophers, let's say, they speak about the machines. For example, Aristotle knew perfectly that if we would have enough machine, we wouldn't need slaves anymore. But still, because there was not a lot of machines and these machines were quite primitive, it didn't really become an important question. But at the beginning of the Renaissance, the amount of machines is already absolutely amazing, and again, it spread it really like crazy in northern Italy. And for Alberti, it almost represented a danger. And this understanding of machine as a danger is still present, obviously, in the understanding of artificial intelligence as a danger. So the roots of this way of dealing with artificial intelligence, and obviously artificial architecture as well, according to me, is to be found at the very beginning of the Quattrocento, and Alberti is an interesting figure regarding this let's say, this understanding of the role of knowledge and machines in the world.
I want to make just one quick point, but I'm anxious to get Biana's comments and Alfredo's comments and Grace's comments and so on. But I mean, just one point. I'm not so sure about the machine thing. I think that actually he was interested, Alberti was interested particularly in scopic devices and in obviously perspective and those things in terms of measuring vision and stuff. But I'll come back.
Yeah, it's more, I agree, but it's more a kind of passive relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, the scoping device has very little effect on the world. It's mostly about the understanding of the world, but it's not a machine which has a very strong effective transformation, power of transformation on nature, for example.
But okay, let me just make one quick point, and it's kind of what I think is important here is because I do think the kind of whatever we call humanism and whatever that might be is still incredibly relevant, despite the discourse of post-humanism. So I was at a talk the other day, 2 days ago, I think it was, and I think it got it completely wrong. I think, one of the points that Andy Clark says is actually we are not post-human. We are completely human, and it's thanks to the kind of neuroscientific insights into the plasticity of the brain, we can see the way in which these tools can be adopted as a prosthesis to the human imagination. Therefore, the human still remains at the center of everything, and we are these kind of cyborg-like things, but we are in control. Now, what I want to just add to that is that actually that is, I think, precisely the problem right now when it comes to dealing with AI, because you didn't mention the kind of information, Claude Shannon's informational logic, but I think in some ways that abstraction makes it very, very clear. And as soon as we use the term intelligence, we invite all this anthropomorphization, which is really the problem. That is really the crucial problem right now, is that we've got these two different domains, radically different domains, but because we use the same terminology, neurons, synapses, learning, intelligence, and so on, there is an implicit confusion put in there, and we cannot escape this danger of anthropomorphization. That's why my argument is to kind of like say, well, okay, we need to engage right now in the second Copernican revolution. The Earth, the first Copernican, it was Copernicus was saying that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The universe revolves, the Earth revolves around the sun. And I think it's important to understand that we are not the center of things, especially in intelligent entities in the universe. And seen from the perspective of AI, humans are incredibly basic in some senses. We might have consciousness, but and I think that's something we need to do to try and break out of the stranglehold that even post-humanism is in, which is basically a humanistic sort of discourse. But I would just throw that at you as a kind of comment, and I would love to hear from Biana and the others. I'm sorry for hogging the conversation, and Alfredo and Gray.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, congratulations, Philippe. It's really remarkable how you are bringing back your incredible contribution to the field so far, but also putting forward very provocative paths forward, because I agree that this could be multiple contributions. I'm looking forward to reading your document, but and we're running short on time, so I just wanted to put forward a couple of really I think interesting points that you brought up, and I think further elaboration on those, either in your future publications, or it could be a good contribution. One is Neil was just also talking about Claude Shannon, Of course, Claude Shannon has been really fundamental in development and conceptualization of binary logic and quantification approach that we currently use in computation. And what you're putting forward is the need for quantifying AI. And also, I think it could be quite interesting if you could elaborate on significance of that for architectural intelligence or significant of that in architectural application. I think what you are putting forward as your definition of architecture as a knowledge-based problem or process is really, really critical. And that's really strong in the way that you're arguing in your chapter organization. And what could be fascinating here is going back to this idea of multiple renaissances, or renaissance as a fuzzy boundary that kind of defined how information and relationships were recognized. I am going back to the way that you were defining what architects have been occupied in the past 5-6 years, which specifically when further the material computation movement, and also in the past few years, looking at architecture as something that we can address through language. So what you're highlighting, that we have to think beyond algebra and beyond linguistics, I think is really provocative. And I think about the famous AI winter chart that we've seen, right? In terms of from 1950s, there's been this valleys and peaks of conversations around AI. And I think thinking about what might be your proposal for adapting this conversation about information for architecture, because I think that could be a really significant contribution. Over the years, for a lot of authors, specifically conferences, have looked at keyword uses in architecture. For instance, this past year in Arcadia, we had a new initiative called Cultural History Project, which is looking at over 40 years of documents and looking at keywords and how over the years it's migrating from more fabrication focus to more, in this case, in the past few years, more artificial intelligence focus. And I think what you're contributing here is it could be quite pivotal, and mapping of that over recent architectural computational design history could be quite interesting as some possible thoughts forward. But congratulations.
Thanks a lot, Baena. Yeah, actually, I mean, part of this work is based also on the courses I've developed and the different lectures I gave in the past years. Ideally, it's very difficult because I see this work as a kind of just as a piece in a more global mapping of the architectural history of at least the past 50 years, let's say, but I'm trying to go a bit beyond that. But ultimately, let's say, I believe that if we want to understand AI in a nice way, in the discipline of architecture, there's a couple of concepts that will be absolutely essential. I mean, the role of logics, obviously, even if we have the feeling that maybe logic is not that important because we are now in a kind of connectionist dream in artificial intelligence, and the symbolic old-fashioned AI didn't work really well. But according to me, it does not mean that logics is not valid anymore. It will become even more important when we will need to let's say, to find rigorous and strong mathematical demonstrations about what happens in artificial intelligence. So logic is not out of the picture, let's say. Another important concept we need to understand really well is obviously the one of information and computation. Information, the classical theory of information by Shannon, it's just a tiny piece of what we have to deal with when we speak about information nowadays. It's also not a very difficult mathematical theory compared to some other more recent theories. The concept of computation, I would say, is still not, it's understood well for Turing machines and things like that, but there are some hypotheses about the fact that, for example, what happens in the brain is a kind of computation that is not a Turing-based computation. So it's, I believe it's a kind of super interesting hypothesis. So the concept of computation itself might evolve quite strongly in the future. And ultimately, a super important concept is definitely the one of probabilities. And as I said, probably one of the most important misreading of modern science is about the opposition between determinism and non-determinism. And for example, Laplace has been attached to this idea of deterministic science. Why? Because of the famous Laplace divide. But Laplace himself, as I said, he was a strong proponent of the importance of probabilities, and one of the best theoretician on probability theory, by the way, at his time. So I think this kind of thing might lead to a partial rereading of the recent postmodern approaches in architecture, who were dealing with a few concepts like associated with non-determinism, like emergence, swarm intelligence, and all these kind of families of concepts, which ultimately, according to me, I'm not saying they are not important, they are, but we might now, there's probably a necessity to readdress this past 20 years of architecture dealing with swarm intelligence, and emergence and material computation, etc., in a new way, let's say. For example, material computation on a purely logical level, it does not really mean anything, the material computation can be just like simulated or emulated with digital processes. The importance of biomimetic architecture, for example, is a trap, because biomimetic architecture says basically that everything which is done in nature is good. It's exactly like saying that human intelligence is the ultimate form of intelligence. But then what about artificial intelligence? So I would say there's a lot of things in architecture, especially, for example, biomimetism, that won't apply at the age of artificial intelligence, because by definition, we cannot deal with artificial intelligence if we accept at the very beginning some biomimetic hypothesis saying that human intelligence or natural intelligence is to be copied. If it's just about copying the nature, then what's the point? We will obviously never discover what real artificial intelligence could be about. it won't be real artificial intelligence. It will just be a copy of natural intelligence. So I would say at the age of AI, there's many hypotheses that were extremely important in the past 20 years in architecture that we might need to live on the side. Yeah.
Okay. So thanks, Philippe. Congratulations.
Thanks.
One, maybe a couple of two comments on the like in the kind of in the imaginary of what computing is. Like the father of computer is Charles Babbage, and he really did not build any functional computer.
No.
But the concept really is that it is the multi-purpose machine. So the image of computing is never defined. It will always evolve. It's maybe the most tricky of all machines. But at the same time, also you can say it's a machine. It comes from the mechanical world. It has remained in the mechanical world. Maybe now it's moving. Some of the techniques are moving to the DNA, to molecular computing, to kind of trying to understand that. Maybe that's a maybe there I see a limit that the problematic like of computing is that even artificial intelligence cannot do what Wozniak, one of the creators of Apple Computer, says. I would really be amazed about artificial intelligence if it gives me coffee in the morning, if it prepare my coffee. That's his test. So that is interesting. It's a joke, but it's a kind of interesting joke because computing still is in the realm of the imaginary of what you can produce inside the Turing machine today. So biology is another type of computation also. It is computation that deals with matter. Like a plant just needs sun, CO2, and produces the cereal for your breakfast. And so there is another when you begin to think about materiality, I think the materiality not only to the mechanical materiality that we have today, but there is another, the biomass, the earth that began to do all those things. So that's one. I think that's one part of really the computing machinery has that Charles Babbage from its birth condition. The other one is how to understand it, how to understand it, and it's like, for example, you mentioned the deterministic. So deterministic interpretation is one. But for me, like I find more interesting the ones from anthropologists. And anthropologists, like there's a school, it's Rob Kling from the UC Irvine. From the very beginning, like in the 1970s, 1980s, they began to kind of frame that computing is a consumer phenomenon. In today's capitalistic society, it is at the end a consumer phenomenon. So he said that the way to understand it is to see how it emerges as a consumer phenomenon, how it gets marketed. For example, in architecture, how does it move inside the kind of the psyche of the firm? Like why in the 1990s the firms were firing upper management because they needed to buy computers because the clients were asking for it. And I remember going to firms in Japan and here in the US, and they were telling me like the most expensive thing was like the salaries and healthcare, and then the second was computers, and they were beginning to implement it. And so it is a consumer phenomenon in there between magazines and also like fairs that architects have, and what the clients consume from media and all that. So there's kind of like those two frameworks at the same time. One that is trying to be defined, like when it emerged, computing in the 1970s and early 80s, it was more about really, it was trying to be like computing is the mind, which is another also consumer phenomena. Like biologists in the 1940s, they would consider that intelligence was in the nervous system, not in the brain. That was for like a long time among biologists that the main nervous system, not the brain. But when computer emerged, this kind of thing, this kind of image began to appear. That is, the brain is the computer. Those associations are very tricky. They're not very clear. Like Marvin Minsky talks about that when he was beginning to develop the artificial intelligence field in the 1950s. So I think maybe like it's a tricky. It's like a moving suns. I think the computer phenomena always emerge as a moving suns that you cannot like have to kind of understanding as moving suns. And so I think that's I think in the end I think it's really gonna be moving suns. It's not gonna be fully defined. It's gonna continue. It's gonna like now NVIDIA is developing chips that are fully dedicated for vision. Like today's computer is AI is very primitive. It's just visions. And
I agree.
For example, for me, the generative AI, for me, what going to be the most important thing is when is the thing that I find more interesting is the major producer of images. I don't know how many million images per month are being generated. When we get into the trillions of images, and when you go into Google, you try to look for Donald Trump, and you do not know if that image was AI generated or it was a real picture, I think they were moving in the consumer phenomenon is even bigger than the technology. Because all of a sudden you're gonna have trillions and trillions of images that are gonna be better quality than the real images. So that the consumer phenomena maybe begins to affect in a different way than just the technology itself. I mean, those are kind of two comments. I think the Charles Babbage and the consumer phenomena of the technology.
Yes, I agree. But you know the last phenomenon you mentioned, which is about data poisoning, is indeed absolutely amazing, and it's. I mean, it could be it could lead to a thesis in itself, because it's absolutely amazing, and I agree with you. At some point, I didn't deal with this kind of more social phenomena. Also, first, I mean, my work is, let's say, at the interface of a conceptual approach and an historical approach, but also, in fact, I didn't really deal with AI. I'm speaking about AI from time to time in the dissertation, but let's say I'm just discussing a couple of ideas that are, let's say, that are obviously important, and ideas that are existing already in the past, at least at an embryological level, or in a kind of embryonic state, let's say. But yeah, it was a choice, because in any case I couldn't deal with everything, and it's probably something that will come later. But yes, I agree with you. The computer is a social phenomena. It's also it's also about the history of Western, or I mean, nowadays it's not Western, it's global. It's the history of global capitalism. I mean, we cannot make a clear distinction between the social and the economical context and let's say the scientific principles of what happens within a computer. It's clear, but yeah, I mean, I had to choose, let's say, because in any case I couldn't talk about too many things. But I agree, and I also remember reading your thesis, because it was one of the first theses, if I'm right, in the discipline of architecture, dealing with the introduction of computers in architectural offices, and and I more or less have it quite precisely in my mind, even if I read it quite a long time ago. And it, yeah, in architectural offices, it's true that at the very beginning, architect didn't really know how to use computers. It was expensive. It created more problems than it solved solutions. I mean, it created more problems than solutions. But yeah, I mean, nowadays obviously the situation is different because we have more advanced softwares, etc. And nowadays somebody who does not have a computer in an architecture office, I mean, is the guy who is making the coffee, you know. I mean, not having a computer simply means zero productivity, as simple as that. So at some point, the situation you described in the 80s has changed quite radically in the past 20 years or even more, 10 years, let's say. But already in the past 20 years, it was clear that someone without a computer in an architecture office would not be accepted anymore because it's just a useless person. And it's the same everywhere in any case. So I would say this social phenomenon nowadays, it's just part of the everyday reality. And even if AI is still creating problems in architecture offices, I'm pretty sure that in 5 years, it will be so easy and common to use artificial intelligence that it's going to be as basic as AutoCAD, you know. But the problem will remain about what is the real nature of artificial intelligence, you know. I mean, it's not because we have AutoCAD that we are solving the problem of what is architecture. And it's not because we will have artificial intelligence tools in all offices that we will have answers to what is artificial intelligence. So I would say on a more conceptual level, it's not going to change the problem. That's my feeling. This problem will have to be addressed by scientists on a rigorous basis, exactly like what happened with the concept of energy. You know, I mean, everyone had a steam engine. I mean, every single factory or workshop had a steam engine at the end of the 19th century. But only few people were giving a precise scientific answer about what is energy on a scientific level. And I think this is what will happen with artificial intelligence. We will all be using artificial intelligence, but only a handful of scientists might be able to really find what are the principles of artificial intelligence. The second thing regarding Charles Babbage, you're right. He never built any properly working machine. It was too complex. While, I mean, he perfectly understood what a computer could be. But let's say on a conceptual level, I think if he would have had the understanding of what a kind of Turing machine is about, maybe he would have created much more simple computers. You know, in fact, if the Babbage machine was that complex, it's also because on a mathematical level, it didn't have a theoretical definition of what a computer, a universal computation is really about. At least I mean, he had a definition of it, but not a definition which was as crystal clear as the one of Alan Turing. So this is all, according to me, it explains also why the machine by Babbage, the analytical engine, which was a real universal one, because the difference engine was not universal, but the analytical engine, it was universal in a modern sense, but still it was not a beautiful, amazingly simple machine as the one that was theorized by Shannon, you know. And I believe that if Babbage would have had the definition of not Shannon, sorry, Turing, if Babbage would have had the definition of Turing, probably maybe he would have built his computer in 6 months rather than investing millions of pounds in a machine that he never managed to build eventually.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. But the concept of computing in general is that it's changing. It's a changing image.
yeah, it's constantly changing. It's constantly moving, and this is what's interesting also. And let's say, yeah, you spoke also about taking the computer as a model for human thought, for the brain. This hypothesis, which is the one of computationalism, and I mean, I'm borrowing the name computationalism from cognitive science, but I'm giving it a different meaning, because the computational hypothesis in cognitive science, I mean, the computationalist hypothesis in cognitive science is ultimately, at least today, a metaphysical hypothesis. Because, I mean, we don't know if the brain is working like a computer. It might be the case, but maybe it's working in a completely different way. What's interesting is that in any case, making this hypothesis leads to interesting results. So if we take it as a working hypothesis within a modern scientific method of investigation, then it's a very interesting hypothesis. But obviously, if we take it as a metaphysical hypothesis, we are completely wrong, because we know nothing about how the brain is really working at the moment.
Ray, do you want to?
Well, I think we're well over time, and
Sorry.
We'll push back to this afternoon, so we'll start getting through. So plenty of time to say something.
Okay, well, I mean, the things first of all, I remember the presentation that you gave. It was over a year ago about how much information is taken in by a child when the child is learning to speak and so forth, and this idea of being able to train an AI on a low quantity data set, right?
Yes.
That was a fascinating talk, and I see some of the strains of that coming through this, and I really appreciate the kind of intellectual history of AI. But I get back to this discussion of determinism and non-determinism or indeterminism, and I think there's that. This is sort of the crux of the matter that I think you are approaching, and I have to confess I didn't catch everything. But I look at these two versions of the Vitruvian man, and in the first glance they look quite similar. On second glance, they're utterly different, because Leonardo built into it a kind of indeterminacy, that you can never square the circle, that there are two centers, not one center. And Cesriano was trying to rationalize all of that and to, bring the human body into a single geometry. And, as a result, the body gets distorted and, yada, yada. It just doesn't work out. And somehow I think that's where we've been and we've always been.
Well, there are two versions of the Cesarian. We only see one of them. There's one in the serpent as well.
Well, but still, he's reducing it. I mean, in the one case and in the other case, but it's, I don't know. It's this idea of sort of hovering on the cusp between something that is mathematically determined and something that utterly isn't. And that notion that the child takes in so much information and that it cannot be reduced, in a sense. So anyway, I just want to thank you for your work, and congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
One last thing, I think the AI today also has a problem of energy.
Yeah.
So I think that when you mentioned the energy in those drawings of the Renaissance was really nice, because today AI I think that's the limit. Like some
Yes, there's a minimal equivalence. I mean, there's a minimal consumption of energy for each single eraser of a bit. This has been theorized in the 60s by Landauer, and recently some experiments brought let's say proofs at some point. I mean, an experiment can never be a proof, obviously, but some experiments brought some further confirmation about the fact that there's an equivalence between the abstract concept of information and the physical concept of energy. Which, by the way, it's kind of funny because the concept of information in the theory of Shannon, it comes from thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, but Shannon didn't really pay attention to the strict equivalence of information and energy. But later on, Landauer in the 1960s, early 1960s, he came up with an equivalence between energy and the eraser of a bit of information. So far, we believe that, I mean, it's considered as a kind of limit. If we look at the history of the steam engine, or at the history of the mechanical engine, the Graal was always trying to reach the theoretical limit of efficiency of the steam engine, or the explosion engine. And obviously now when we build computers, we are also trying to reach a kind of ultimate theoretical limit of energy consumption for the creation or destruction of information.
Yeah, no, I think that's what they find the most interesting thing in today's the limits. Like how when you begin to describe limits of things, you begin to see kind of thresholds that makes you.
But limits are always porous, right?
Yeah, the limits of the problem are they put you down. They don't.
They're always more porous than people make them out.
No, but through there you can begin to understand what is the next plateau, because the next invention is not continue with the same way. It's changing it.
Okay. We need to wrap up our morning.
Okay.
Thank you, Philippe. That was really
Thanks a lot.
Demonstration of erudition and scholarship, and sets a very high bar for our DDes. And we will give feedback on the text as we can. Thank you for all the feedback from Bayana, from Alfredo, and from Gray. We will start again in roughly an hour's time. We have Jose on at 3 o'clock, then we have Barak at 3:45, and that brings to the end of our presentations. So thank you again for everyone. I hope you can join us for our final sessions. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Have,
you.
have a good lunch.
Thank you.
Shame you're not here.
Okay.
Shame you're not here.
Thank you.
We'll be sitting outside in the sun.
Ah, lucky you.
Philippe, thank you for continuous contributions over the years.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Bayana. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
It was, I mean, we keep it in touch, obviously.